Great. Thank you and good afternoon to all of you. My name is Nikki Okuk and I am with CALSTART. We are the administrator for the California HVIP program. And we are here today to review the process for participating in our set-aside called the Innovative Small E-Fleet Set-Aside. Today's webinar is designed specifically for the providers, which we will define, but it is intended really to help the providers and dealers who would like to assist small fleets in participating in this new set-aside within HVIP. I'm going to go through a series of slides explaining the program and the process. We will pause occasionally for questions. You are also welcome to put any questions you have in the Q&A section. I don't believe the raise hand function is available today, so put your questions there. We are also able to unmute folks if they would like to speak. I am joined today also by my colleagues, so I'll turn it over to Andrea with the California Air Resources Board to introduce herself.
Hi, thank you, Nikki. So my name is Andrea Morgan. I am the lead staff for HVIP policy over at the California Air Resources Board. And we are very excited to be here today and to be launching the Innovative Small E-Fleets pilot from HVIP. So I very much appreciate everyone's attendance today and Nikki leading today's discussion.
Thanks. I just stopped sharing for a moment because I want to make sure that we're actually looking at the most recent version of our slides here. So let me do a quick check. Here we are. We have some updates for you guys today, so thank you guys for bearing with us. As we've been developing this program, all of your feedback has been incredibly helpful.
While Nikki is pulling that up, I'll just say the Innovative Small E-Fleets pilot is really intended to be a way for CARB to start to pilot these new innovative strategies to bring more smaller fleets into the transition to zero emission and help lower barriers that small fleets face. So we're really hoping to use this initial pilot as a way for us to learn lessons about what does and doesn't work, as we're really striving to help more small fleets throughout the state and make the transition to zero emission. So this is, again, an initial pilot. We're sure that we will learn things throughout this year and are really looking to apply these learnings both to HVIP and to CARB's larger heavy-duty incentive programs. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nikki to start going into the slides.
Great, thank you. All right, so about ISEF, as Andrea was just mentioning, the intention of this program is really to assist smaller fleets in making this transition to zero emission vehicles. For this set aside, CARB has assigned $25 million available in funding. For this set aside, the definition of small fleets is 20 vehicles or less, and the program is available for class 3 through 8 vehicles. Now, a secondary goal of this program really is to explore alternative financing mechanisms. So for those of you who are very familiar with HVIP, in the past, it has limited the way that you're allowed to use lease, rental, or truck as a service options. And so really consider ISEF as the area where we can begin to explore how these tools could potentially help small fleets in their transition. So just like HVIP, it is a first come, first serve voucher program. However, there's an additional sort of participant in this process, and that is what we are calling the provider. So the provider can be companies who offer leases or short-term rentals, and these are the folks that are going to be working directly with small fleets and dealers. We'll get more into exactly the definition, and it should be noted that sometimes dealers are also providers. So if you're one of those that happens to be both, that includes you. For this process, we're opening this week to allow providers to begin presenting to us the types of offerings they would like to give to small fleets. And then we'll be waiting until the end of August until we've had the opportunity to review those and post up those which are eligible and approved. And at the end of August is when we'd actually allow dealers to start putting in voucher requests for small fleets. So we talked a little bit about who is an eligible small fleet. An ISEF eligible small fleet, again, is a fleet that has 20 vehicles or less. In accordance with other HVIP rules, this also means vehicles that are currently listed on non-op. It also requires that these small businesses have less than $15 million a year in annual revenue, which is currently California statute definitions for small business. And for this program, it would have to meet both of those requirements. We're looking currently at privately owned trucking companies. So this program is not currently open to, say, shuttle bus companies or public agencies of any kind. We're really specifically looking to work with California small trucking fleets. And then in all situations, this would also include owner operators. So if you're just a one person, one truck operation, would also qualify for this program. Now, we discussed a little bit about what providers might look like. So an ISEF provider can include companies who sell these vehicles, companies who rent vehicles, those who are traditionally involved in the financing of zero-emission vehicles, and in some cases, even those companies who traditionally are involved in the fueling of commercial trucks. Now, any of those, or it may in some cases actually be a team that is a combination of these. If you could imagine perhaps a company who provides fuel and charging as a service, partnering with a company who also finances vehicles, and then offering that package as really a team to a small fleet. As long as those sort of two providers have decided upon their relationship with each other and the type of offering they'd like to make to a small fleet, they're welcome to fill out what we're calling our provider eligibility application. It's a brief sort of, I think, 3-page form, which describes the offering. Now, providers can put forward really any sort of combination of offerings. We're not requiring that they cover the full spectrum, but the offering can include things like the fuel could be included, or perhaps if insurance is extremely high on these much more expensive vehicles, some sort of insurance buy down could also be included. So what we're really looking for, though, the objective of all of this is that the bottom line, the very last price that is presented to the small fleet is something comparable to what they would be paying for a new diesel vehicle of a similar make and model. So we want to take in operational costs where possible, and the charger as well, though we're not covering charger installation at this time. So I'm just reviewing this and repeating it again, which is that a proposal really can take many forms. It could be a purchase, a standard purchase with standard financing. It could be a lease. It could be a standard lease, or maybe an all-inclusive lease that includes your maintenance and your service. Short-term rentals are again now available here, whereas they may not have been in HVIP previously. And when we say other service agreements, usually what we're referring to is sort of that truck as a service, energy as a service, vehicle as a service model that we've seen many companies are exploring, and we'd like to have an opportunity to make that available to smaller fleets. So a provider can be, you know, an HVIP dealer that is an HVIP dealer now. It could be an HVIP OEM that's an HVIP OEM now, but it can also be companies who may not have participated in HVIP in the past in this role. So please just keep in mind that you can participate in this program even if you haven't necessarily been working with HVIP in the past. The only difference is that if you're not an HVIP dealer or OEM, you're going to need to find one, right? So you'll need to have that same point of sale contact that you always needed in the past to work through HVIP. So if you are a company that provides leasing and rental of vehicles, you would still need to work with your dealer wherever you purchase those vehicles through the standard HVIP system. You would be putting in the provider application, right? The provider application we just discussed. That leasing or rental company is going to present to us the offering that they will make to small fleets. However, it's still your HVIP approved dealer that puts in the voucher request. So in some ways, it's very similar to HVIP. It will feel very familiar to those who have participated in HVIP before. However, it's important to keep in mind that the provider and the dealer steps are separate. So I've highlighted some of the differences between these two programs, but I'll just enumerate them once again. So HVIP standard, for those of you who are familiar and have purchased vehicles through HVIP before, usually requires a minimum of 3 years in a financing agreement or leasing agreement. ISEF, on the other hand, is going to allow for more flexibility. We listen to small fleets in our small fleet focus groups, many of whom said things like, we'd like to be able to try a vehicle before we commit to buying one. And so these are opportunities for providers to really get small fleets in where they may not have been able to get in before. In HVIP, HVIP no longer funds chargers, and the voucher is applied only to the vehicle purchase price. Because we understand that the barriers to entry for small fleets are very high, and then sometimes there's considerations beyond just the purchase price of the vehicle, we've allowed for ISEF funding to include things like chargers. And if fueling is included as part of your monthly service package, it can include fuel as well. Insurance, maintenance, and other costs. We're open to exploring other service offerings as long as they're explained thoroughly within that initial provider application. This continues to be open on a first come, first served basis. However, we have been very specific that the eligible fleet in this case must be 20 vehicles or less and less than $15 million a year in revenue. And then in HVIP, again, the two parties to that purchase are typically the purchaser and the dealer. And in ISEF, you'll find that this is very, very often going to be a three-party purchase. You'll have a provider, you'll have a purchaser, and you'll have your dealer. So just keep that in mind. There's an extra party to the process. In HVIP, it's capped at 30 vehicles for fleets. However, for this program, we're capping it at 5 vehicles for each small fleet. Now, to overcome really sort of the largest barrier for the smallest fleets, we realize that there will be a need for additional funding. So right off at the beginning, we should tell you that the maximum that's available for each of these classes of vehicles is 2x of what is available in the HVIP catalog, plus your incentive, plus ups like DAC and disadvantaged communities and others, but I'll let Andrea explain that a little bit more. The only thing that I'd like to say about this is that this is the maximum that is available. So if you're a provider and you have figured out a great way to package a vehicle with a charger and a service plan for a small fleet, and your price actually comes in slightly lower than this maximum, we encourage you to put your true realistic pricing expectations, because one of the ways that these provider applications are evaluated, say in the case of a contingency list, would be something like cost effectiveness. So while it is tempting always to go to the very maximum voucher amount that is available, cost effectiveness will be taken into consideration. And so we encourage you to reflect your true and accurate pricing at all times. I'll go to the next slide so that Andrea can explain how plus-ups are applied.
Thanks, Nikki. So now we'll walk through a quick example of how to calculate what the maximum ISEF voucher amount is. So in this example, we'll be calculating the price for a Class 8 battery electric truck that will be used to perform drayage operations and is domiciled in a disadvantaged community. So as Nikki mentioned, you can calculate the final voucher amount, including modifiers, using the same methodology in HVIP standard. So that essentially means that you'll be multiplying the base voucher amount by the modifier, And then that final voucher amount is the sum of the base voucher amount and its modifiers. So walking through our example, in HVIP, a Class 8 truck has a base voucher amount of $120,000. And because that truck is participating in ISEF, the voucher is doubled or increased by $120,000. So we mentioned the Class 8 truck is performing drayage operations. So it's eligible for a 25% Class 8 drayage truck early adopter bonus. To calculate the bonus, you multiply the 25% by the $120,000 HVIP base voucher amount. So that comes out to $30,000. We also mentioned the truck is located in a disadvantaged community. So it's eligible for a 15% bonus. So to calculate that, we'll multiply 15% by $120,000, and that gives a bonus of $18,000. So the total voucher amount is the sum of the base voucher amount plus the $20,000 for participating in ISEF, plus the $30,000 drayage truck bonus and the disadvantaged community bonus of $18,000. So that brings our total to $288,000. So that's the maximum amount that you could request for this hypothetical scenario. So you do have to demonstrate a couple of things in order to be eligible for the Class 8 drayage truck early adopter bonus and the disadvantaged community bonus. The Class 8 drayage truck bonus functions the same way that it does within HVIP. To qualify, a purchaser must submit a copy of their permission to enter a port or rail yard, such as the Uniform Intermodal Interchange and Facilities Access Agreement, or UIIA authorization. There are some differences within ISEF for the disadvantaged community voucher bonus. So to qualify this for the disadvantaged community voucher modifier, you'd need to check the California Climate Investment Priority Populations tool at the link shown on the screen to see if the truck will be domiciled in either a disadvantaged community, a disadvantaged and low-income community, or a low-income community within half a mile of the disadvantaged community, or in a potential low-income household within half a mile of a disadvantaged community. So I want to highlight that those last two categories expand upon what's included in the requirements for standard HVIP. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about voucher requests. Standard HVIP also has some additional eligibility requirements associated with the disadvantaged community voucher, like fleet size and annual revenue. But since ISEF already has restrictions in place on the fleet size and annual revenue to participate, you don't have to worry about those again for the disadvantaged community voucher modifier. If you're eligible for ISEF, the only factor you'll need to meet in order to be eligible for the disadvantaged community modifier is being located in one of the different categories shown on the screen. So with that, I think let's pause and see if there are any questions. I know we're covering a lot of material, so we'll see if there's any questions on these initial concepts, and then talk a little bit more through how the actual process works of requesting vouchers and next steps and timelines.
All right, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. The first is just regarding slides. These slides will be made available after the webinar. We'll send them out in both link form to the attendees, as well as having them posted on the californiahvip.org website. The second question is, are there OEM caps, and how many vehicles can they sell in ISEF? So yes, it's not an OEM cap. In fact, it's a provider cap, and I'll cover it a little bit later on another slide, but there is a provision in order to allow for, we'd like to see the most sort of diverse set of applications available in the first round here. Next question, can you expand on the cost effectiveness factor? I will get to the list of criteria by which we'll evaluate providers just in a little bit here. And did you mention the limit is 5 vehicles per fleet? Yes. So per small fleet, there is a limit of maximum 5 vehicles to purchase through the program. The fleet itself would have a cap of 20 vehicles in order to be eligible for the program. So I hope I answered most of your questions, and those that I haven't yet, I hope will be answered in the next few slides. Okay, here's one additional question, which maybe I'll turn to Andrea, which says, can you discuss a little more the cost for charging infrastructure and how much could potentially be included in the proposal? The physical charger, engineering, installation, etc.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So to make this program as streamlined and simple as possible, there essentially is not a separate voucher that you'd be applying for infrastructure, but you could use the ISEF voucher to cover certain portions of infrastructure. So the types of infrastructure that could be eligible are the charging equipment, as well as software for managing load, or battery storage. And similarly on the hydrogen side, you could use the voucher amount to cover the purchase of equipment for on-site hydrogen generation or hydrogen fuel storage. However, the ISEF voucher cannot be used to fund installation costs or labor costs associated with engineering or design of the infrastructure installation. It's only actual physical purchases of equipment or software associated with the infrastructure.
Great, thank you. Another question is, a fleet performing drayage operations get 25% off the cost. Will a fleet performing drayage operations is eligible for an additional 25% on top of their base voucher?
Yeah, so and that only applies for Class 8 vehicles. So I can tell you right off the bat, that essentially means that any Class 8 vehicle that's performing drayage operations could be eligible for an additional $30,000 in their voucher amount. So increasing the base voucher amount, which is $120,000 for a Class 8 truck, up to $150,000 for a Class 8 truck that's performing drayage operations.
From the same asker, they say, if there's only 25 million available, is it correct then that at 288,000 each in your example, that would only fund 86 or 87 trucks? That would be a correct calculation if we expected all of the applicants to be Class 8 drayage voucher requests, but we expect to receive applicants for other types of delivery vehicles, box trucks, and other types of tractors. So in that case, those voucher amounts would be much lower, and we expect to fund more vehicles than that. However, it's important to remember that this is a set aside intended for learning in the first year. So $25 million is representative of an intention to explore alternative financing mechanisms and new tools for small fleets. I don't see any other questions popping up. Oh, here we go. What is the funding limit for the infrastructure part of the vouchers? So go ahead, Andrea.
So for the infrastructure portion, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One, that you're looking at an overall voucher amount of what we just described. So for this example of this Class 8 truck that's performing drayage operations and located in a DAC, the maximum voucher amount is $288,000. So it's up to the provider to decide how you want to split those funds. That can either be applied completely to the truck, or you can use it to support a portion of the truck purchase as well as a portion of infrastructure. There isn't a set cap as to how much can be used to support infrastructure, but there is a requirement that you use at least some of the voucher amount to support the purchase of a truck. So in all cases, you do need to use some of the ISEF voucher to support a truck. You can't use it for infrastructure alone, but totally up to you on how you want to make that split between the truck and infrastructure or other costs like insurance costs.
Great, thank you. I'll pause on questions for just a moment here. Oh, nope, there are more. Since you're using the term truck, are passenger vehicles not eligible? Correct. Passenger vehicles are not eligible in this program. We do recognize that in, I think, the class 3 category, there are some cargo vans and shuttle buses that can sometimes be built out for use as a delivery vehicle and are sometimes used in sort of a people moving capacity. Even those, if the PO, shows that the vehicle is being built for the purposes of moving people and not goods, it would not be eligible for this program. Can these funds be combined with other state funds such as the Carl Moyer program? Andrea, would you like to answer that?
Sure. So for the purposes of stacking, the same requirements that apply with an HVIP standard apply here. So essentially what that means is you can't stack ISEF funds with other state program funds to cover the same costs. So if you applied your ISEF voucher to only cover the cost of the vehicle, you could not stack with Carl Moyer funds to cover more of the cost of the vehicle. You could, however, use Carl Moyer to support infrastructure installation, for example, or the Energize program to support infrastructure programs, which Energize is run by the California Energy Commission, so it's another state funding source. You are welcome to stack ISEF funds with other federal dollars. So if you're aware of any federal opportunities for funding, you can use ISEF there to cover both the cost of the vehicle and infrastructure. And similarly, you could stack ISEF with local dollars. So sometimes air districts have funds at their discretion, or port fees, or the port clean truck rates. If there's funding available through that, you could use that to stack as well, but not with other state programs like Carl Moyer.
All right, I've got a couple of questions regarding, again, the volume of vehicles that would be funded, pointing out here that there's over 10,000 sole proprietors in the, I believe, Los Angeles harbor. What happens if funding is not used in certain classes? Could it be rolled over to other classes? So we actually have not assigned funding to various classes. It's still first come, first serve. So if it were to be requested entirely by, say, drayage operators, then that is where the funding would go. We're not holding it for rollover. We did allow the ability for a contingency list once the funding is completely exhausted. However, we're leaving to CARB's discretion how that contingency list may be used or funded in the future. It says, does the general HVIP OEM cap apply to this program, or can the vehicles sold through this program be exempted from the OEM cap?
Yeah, so I can take that one. So yes, the OEM cap does apply to this program as well. For those of you who are not familiar with the HVIP OEM cap, essentially what that is any OEM can only have 100 unredeemed vouchers in their hand at any given time. However, this is on a rolling cap. So as more vehicles are delivered, they come off that OEM cap list. And additionally, as OEMs can request a case-by-case exemption from CARB so that they can exceed that 100 vehicle cap. And essentially what the OEM cap is intended to do is to really help with the timely delivery of vehicles. So when CARB receives requests to exceed the OEM cap, we look at a number of factors associated with the manufacturer to make sure that they have the capacity to build vehicles in a way that they would still be meeting the delivery deadlines associated with HVIP that also apply to ISEF. So it does still apply here. If you are an OEM or a dealer interested in having a certain OEM participate within ISEF, highly encourage you to work with that OEM to request a case-by-case review for CARB to get an exceedance on the OEM cap if that's a problem that you're running into.
Great, thank you. And one more question for you, Andrea. Does the vehicle need to perform exclusively drayage operations in order to qualify for the drayage voucher modification?
No, so it does not need to perform exclusively drayage operations. However, we will be looking again for that documentation to show that the truck does have authorization to enter ports or rail yards. So that is what is going to be required and what we'd be looking at before we authorize the drayage truck voucher enhancement.
Do the vouchers have an expiration considering the current longer vehicle lead times? ISEF vouchers will have the same period for redemption as a standard HVIP voucher. Sorry, go ahead, Andrea. I see you came off mute.
Yeah, so that's, Nikki's correct. It will have the same requirements as within HVIP. So I believe that that's 18 months. But we will continue to allow OEMs and dealers to request a case-by-case review through CARB if there are problems outside of your control leading to delays in the vehicle being delivered and built.
Gary Hsu asks, will the provider eligibility application be viewable publicly? So the complete application won't be viewable publicly. However, the eligible providers will be tabulated. So there will be a listing of eligible providers where small fleets can sort of shop and browse and see what offerings available, find contact information, and then reach out in order to find the provider who's offering both the truck and the package that they're looking for. So that will all be listed on the californiahvip.org website /purchasers. That's the section where you'll find the steps to participate and also sort of the directory of providers when it's available. And you should see that going up here in the next couple of weeks. Again, we're opening for provider applications this week. We'll be reviewing them and then they should all be up and listed in order for voucher requests to start being requested at the end of August. A question for you, Andrea. So since the port clean truck fee is being rolled out through HVIP, will that also be stackable with ISEF?
Yeah, so great question, and I'm realizing that the port clean truck fee is likely not the best example that I could have given of local funds, because no, you cannot stack HVIP with ISEF as well. So another example of local funds that you potentially could stack with, depending on, of course, the local funds requirements, would be like South Coast has the mobile source review committee funds occasionally for various demonstration and pilot projects. So that's something that you could potentially stack with ISEF. And there is more information available within the HVIP implementation manual that kind of gives a listing of what local funds, some examples of local funds that are available that you could stack. And so those would still apply here to ISEF.
And then lastly, Robert Kelly asked, you mentioned that it's first come, first serve, but that it is also competitive on a request for funds. So it is first come, first serve. What I mentioned was that provider applications, as we evaluate them, especially in the case of a contingency list, we will be looking for things like, well, there'll be a slide about it, but it's things like is this provider offering comprehensive? Is it really easy for small fleets to get started? Is it cost effective and bringing the price really down to where we would like it to be comparable to a diesel? So that has to do with our evaluation of the provider applications. However, the actual voucher request for small fleets, that is still a first come, first serve process. If we're already approved as an HVIP dealer, what else is required to be approved for ISEF? So if you're an HVIP dealer, then you can put in a voucher request for a small fleet. However, you should be working with a provider. So if you're not providing a really comprehensive wraparound financing option for small fleets, you need to present that to us. So that would be your only additional step. So if I'm a dealership and I sell a particular truck and I see that with say additional funding through the ISEF program, I could offer small fleets a much better rate for that truck, then I would need to put that into the provider application. So if you're just a dealer and you'd like to act as a provider, you do need to do that additional step of filling out your provider application and telling us exactly what is the pricing that you would like to offer small fleets. What is the deadline for potential providers that can apply? So we are opening up for voucher requests on August 31st. If you would like your provider listing to be listed by then, you really need to get your application in within the next couple of weeks. Now, we'll continue to accept, evaluate, and post eligible provider applications. However, if your goal is to have your offering available on opening day, then you should get it to us 2 weeks before we open. That's also on a slide a little bit later. You guys are getting to all of the good questions before we've gotten to all of the slides.
Yeah, so looking at the remaining questions, Nikki, I think we'll probably be hitting on most of them within the next few slides. So let's go ahead and move on with the presentation, and we can certainly come back to the questions if folks continue to have questions after we've presented a little bit more detail on how the flow of voucher requests and providers applying.
Sure thing. So here is sort of an overview of that flow of how to participate in this process, which many of you were asking about. So really the first step, again, is that a provider needs to submit their offering, and that's through the provider eligibility application. We'll take the time to review that and make sure that it meets some of our sort of minimum guidelines, right, of ease and accessibility, of bringing down the price to something that a small fleet can afford that is comparable to diesel. Once that is done, then the provider would be listed up on the HVIP website where small fleets can find them. And the program will open for voucher requests. Again, the date for opening for voucher requests right now is set to August 31st. At that point, a small fleet can always find the vehicles that they're interested in by looking through the catalog, but they really need to also find the provider that they believe is going to give them both the price and the service offering they're looking for. So if a small fleet is really interested in a short-term lease, they would want to find a provider that offers that. However, if they're really interested in doing truck as a service, the all-in option with fuel included, then they're going to want to find a provider that offers that. Those small fleets need to contact those providers, and the provider is the one that's going to give them really a service offering. And it's at that point that the HVIP dealer can submit a voucher request on their behalf, and it's sort of an addendum to that HVIP voucher request later in the redemption process is that service agreement, right? So the agreement between the small fleet and the provider that says, I'm renting a truck for this much on a short-term basis, or I'm doing truck as a service with fuel included for this much per month or per mile. Those are the types of documents that are going to be included later in the voucher request process. The HVIP dealer would go ahead and order the vehicle. They'd submit all of the signed voucher request documentation, including terms and conditions, and have their voucher approved. At that point, the vehicle gets built and delivered to the dealer, and the dealer then completes the full redemption process, right? Which is partially, I just mentioned, is going to include things like your agreement with your provider. Then each party really has some separate sets of responsibilities. So the dealer itself would be acting as they normally do within HVIP. They would receive payment typically from the provider or the small fleet. And then we, as the administrator of this program, reimburse them for their voucher amount. So that's what happens between us and the dealer. Now, the provider is really responsible for making sure that the small fleet meets and continues to meet the participation eligibility requirements for this program. And especially in the case of, say, the short-term rental type of provider, they would need to continually update us on what small fleets are using these vehicles, how often and for how long. So those are some of the responsibilities for the provider. Now, the small fleet, on the other hand, needs to continue to adhere to all the terms and conditions, and they also need to fill out the user surveys that we'll be sending out and collecting information about your vehicle usage all along the way. So here's an idea of some of the vehicles that are eligible within ISEF. As we mentioned, we're looking specifically at trucks, class 3 through 8. All of these vehicles can be found in the catalog, but again, when searching, please remember to exclude from your searches things like buses and shuttle buses, which are not included in this program at this time. All right. So folks were asking about the provider eligibility application. So beginning this week, you'll be able to find a form-like application on our website. When completing the form, providers do not actually need to have already identified the small fleet customer. What we're really asking for them to identify is the offering that they're going to be providing. Now, we do understand that some of you as providers already have a customer in mind. You have a customer who you've identified, you've decided on a price and a vehicle, and that's wonderful. And you can go ahead and fill out the application. But this step in the application is not going to ask for your small fleet sort of purchaser or end user information. It's just going to be questions like, what vehicle are you providing? At what price? Is that per mile or per month? What is included? What assurances of service and maintenance are available? What would you consider a comparable vehicle price, and how does it compare? Things like that. So we're looking for information about what you can offer small fleets and what that each one will be slightly different. We've talked about the availability of leases or financing or rentals. And so what we're trying to do is become very clear in this initial application of what can be provided. There's some additional questions. Yes, we asked what sort of fueling provisions are available. We're really looking for offerings that make the whole process seamless and easy for small fleets. So including either, a charger within the process, assisting the small fleet in understanding how to get that charger installed. These are all steps that are really important for helping small fleets overcome those barriers to entry. Shall I pause here for questions about the provider eligibility application?
It might be good to go on one more slide. I think that's where we had some additional information on how the providers are evaluated, if I recall correctly, and then pause for questions.
Great. Here we are. So provider applications will be evaluated based on, as I mentioned, fuel provisions. So fuel provisions can take a variety of forms, right? They can include things like actually selling the charger and helping the fleet with installation if the fleet is choosing to do a sort of more traditional purchase or lease. A fuel provision, though, could also include things like fuel cards, or in the case of truck and energy as a service, where fuel is actually included and bundled in that monthly or per mile price. So while we are not prescriptive about what form this should take, we only ask that providers are very conscientious and considerate of the fact that it is sometimes difficult for small fleets to find the time and the knowledge to solve for their fueling issues. And so we really encourage providers to assist their small fleets in any way possible. A second point of evaluation would be a final price comparison with that of a diesel equivalent. So when you are also presenting to us what a diesel equivalent looks like, right, you should include what operational costs would be equivalent as well. So if your electric vehicle offering is a truck as a service and therefore it includes both the vehicle and the fueling, then when considering the diesel equivalent, we would be considering both the truck and the fueling on a diesel equivalent. However, if yours is more of a, say, short-term rental and it does not include fuel, then equivalently, we would be looking to compare the diesel equivalent without fuel. So just keep that in mind. We're looking for whatever would be an equivalent cost to a small fleet, or they can still using a diesel engine. Cost effectiveness, yes, we did mention that some consideration will be given to those who are using the most effective use of funds and maybe not seeking the absolute highest voucher amount. The comprehensiveness of the service offering. So we do, again, look for those service offerings which make it seamless and easy for small fleets to participate. So the more that is included, the fewer steps and hurdles that small fleets have to overcome, the better the offering. And same goes for Easy Start. So by Easy Start, we simply mean having lower upfront costs, make it easier for small fleets to get involved. So maybe those types of offerings that don't have very large like cash deposits required upfront from small fleets. Is there anything else you'd like to say about these, Andrea?
No, I think that about covers it. So how about we pause and take a few questions? I know a number have come in. One question, Nikki, was just if we could simply go back one slide, so people could take another look at the one slide ahead of this.
Sure thing. Also asked here is, again, will this recording and presentation be sent out? The presentation certainly will be. It takes a little bit longer for recordings to get compressed and uploaded, but it will be available online eventually. Will the end user always receive the discount? I'm a little confused as to how this will work with short-term rentals. Would you need to request a separate voucher request for each short-term rental? No. So in the case of short-term rentals, right, let's just say I'm truck rental company ABC in Los Angeles, and I'm renting trucks to small fleets. I would receive the voucher upfront initially, right? And I should have identified who my first small fleet customer is in the voucher request process. However, that first customer may only choose to rent that truck for 3 months. After those 3 months, then I can re-rent it to another small fleet. However, each time I do that, I'm going to have to provide that documentation back just so that we can verify that that discounted price is continually being passed on to small fleets, right? We want to make sure that the rental company has requested the voucher, absorbed the voucher into the price of the vehicle, and then is relaying that discounted price onto the small fleets every time they re-rent that electric vehicle. Will all provider applications be approved regardless of CalStart's opinion of the offering? So we do have that criteria for evaluation, right? And there's sort of a minimum criteria, and that we're trying to really, the most important part is that we're getting close to that baseline price, right? So a provider offering, which takes a discount, an ISEF discount, but however, the end price is still much higher than a diesel equivalent and out of reach of a small fleet, would be a provider offering that we would feel doesn't necessarily meet the intent nor minimum requirements of the program. Is there anything you'd like to add to that question, Andrea?
Yeah, sure. I'll chime in there and note that CARB will also be the one making the final call on which eligibility applications are approved for providers. And as Nikki mentioned, we are really looking to make sure this program, the offerings do actually help small fleets. So overall, you all know the goal of this program is to support small fleets in making the transition to zero emission. And I think we all recognize that small fleets face some challenges associated with price and with just the ability to purchase a new truck. So as Nikki mentioned, we are really looking to make sure that the price is somewhat comparable to what they'd be paying with a diesel. But we'll also be looking really closely at what sorts of protections you're offering small fleets. So we will also be evaluating things like how repairability of the vehicle, just like an HVIP standard, making sure that there are servicing options available for those vehicles. And also looking at what the provider can do in terms of if there is something that's wrong with the vehicle or the small fleet faces a challenge, what the backup options are so that the small fleet can continue to have access to a truck. So that's some of what we'll be looking at and evaluating in terms of whether or not a vehicle eligibility or a provider will be approved.
I see a question here. Do ETRUs fall under this category? ETRUs are actually funded in the Clean Off-Road Equipment program called CORE, which can be found at californiacore.org. All right, are utility programs involved in developing the packages? We have not engaged with utility programs in the development of this. However, we do encourage that providers help small fleets contact their utility and investigate whether or not there are utility programs available in your area that can greatly reduce the cost of charger installation and therefore stretch your ISEF voucher even further.
Great. I saw a couple other questions earlier on that I want to make sure we address as well. One of them being, why are shuttle operators or people movers disqualified? So ultimately, that was a policy decision that was made by CARB. As we mentioned earlier, this is an initial pilot that's really aimed to help us understand better how we can support small fleets. So I'll say we do intend to continue providing funding for ISEF in the future. And we will consider whether or not to expand this program to allow for shuttle operators or people movers to be included. But for this go round, we have limited the scope to just focus on trucks performing commercial operations. And then next also saw maybe we saw a question asking, how long does the fleet have to operate the truck after it's deployed? So this is where it gets a little bit different than HVIP, right? And I think Nikki's hit on this a bit, but we don't have the fleets aren't required to operate the truck for a certain amount of time, but there is an expectation that the provider ensures that the truck is on the road in California for at least 3 years. So you can do that in a number of ways, either short-term rental models like Nikki was describing earlier, where you have a number of fleets coming in and out of the truck, but it needs to be operating in California for at least 3 years. But there's not that minimum time frame that an individual fleet has to be driving the vehicle. I'll note that for short-term rental or truck as a service types of agreements, we're expecting that the truck be deployed for a minimum of 200 days out of the year with the small fleet end user. So that's another expectation of providers, is looking 4 ways to ensure that the truck is actually in service and being used throughout the 3-year window that the truck is expected to be operated in California.
Great, thank you. Another question here is, what documentation is required to prove small fleet status? How is that prepared, and who is responsible for furnishing this documentation? So at this time, we do not require any documentation proving that you are a small fleet. However, we will be doing, checks on our end. So we may follow up and ask for additional documentation, but initially with the voucher request process, it's really an attestation. So both the small fleet, the provider, and the dealer are signing a document which say that they believe and attest to the fact that this small fleet meets the eligibility requirements. Now, were it to be found out later that all 3 of those parties had disingenuously or fraudulently signed this attestation document, then the voucher would no longer be valid. So just keep that in mind while we're asking all 3 parties to attest to it, and then we'll do our own checks on the back. But there is no specific documentation that we're requiring in the application process.
I can take this last one. So we have a comment saying ETRUs are off-road, however, they are used on-road since they are used and attached to trucks. Would there be potential to have them be a part of the program in the future? Is there a way to leave comments or suggestions on this for the future of the program? So yes, this is absolutely something that we can consider in the future as we're thinking about how to expand this program further, are different types of vehicles and equipment that could be included. So I'll put my email address in the response to this comment. For folks that have policy suggestions, please feel free to email those to me. And that's something that we'll take into consideration for future iterations of ISEF and ways to more generally improve our heavy duty off-road incentives.
Great, thank you. So moving on just a bit here. We had a couple folks ask about what the cap is for providers. So as we mentioned, we really seek to learn about all of the different offerings that are available, to which end we wanted to prevent the possibility of, say, one provider capturing all of the funding very early in the process. And to do that, we've placed a cap that no more than 15% of the total ISEF set aside could be captured within the first 6 months by a single provider. Now, at the end of that 6-month period, if we have not expended all funds, then that contingency list of requests, perhaps that had come from providers already in the program who'd reached their cap, would be evaluated for funding. Are there any questions about this?
I do see that we have one raised hand, Nikki. If you're able to unmute Scott, we can let him ask his question.
Let's see. I just saw his hand go up as well, and now I can't find it.
All right, maybe he no longer has a question.
Oh, he said he didn't mean to do that. It would be helpful to know what documentation you're going to ask for to prove small fleet status, even if it's not required. In our experience, fleets are highly burdened by the follow-up documentation requested during standard HVIP review. Yeah, so there is no documentation that we're seeking. It is honestly that we would be doing our own internal research if for some reason it was called into question. So I don't have an answer for you in this at this time, but it's not the same type of documentation I think that you are thinking of through the standard HVIP voucher process. All right, I don't see any questions regarding the provider cap or contingency list, so I'm gonna keep moving along here. All right. So the provider is responsible for ensuring that the voucher amount and the terms or conditions are disclosed to the renter or lessee. So in the process of your service agreement, we are definitely going to be checking that the voucher is present and accounted for in purchase orders and service agreement and pricing, et cetera. Also, as Andrea mentioned, that the vehicle needs to be operated in accordance with the rules of this program for 3 years. So while it doesn't have to be with the same fleet, it has to be with a similar fleet. So if you're offering truck as a service or rental, or you're going to be leasing to multiple fleets, all the fleets that you provide this vehicle to need to continue to meet the same criteria. And again, we'll be fact checking that on the back end as well. We will be requiring activity reports. We're very interested in finding out the demand for these vehicles, how small fleets use them, if, when, where, how. So there will be surveys and activity reports required, and it is the provider's responsibility to make sure that those are completed. And the small fleet will also be asked to provide a user survey. And then lastly, there are some EVITP requirements if you're including charging infrastructure, and I'll allow Andrea to explain that.
Great, thanks, Nikki. Happy to talk a little bit more about the EVITP requirements, or electric vehicle infrastructure training program requirements. So as I mentioned earlier, the ISEF voucher can be used to cover a portion of the electric vehicle supply equipment or hydrogen fueling infrastructure costs, including hardware costs, load management software for smart charging, energy storage, and the cost of equipment related to on-site hydrogen fuel storage or production. However, the ISEF voucher can't be used to cover electric vehicle supply equipment or hydrogen fueling infrastructure alone. It does need to be tied with a vehicle voucher request. So additionally, as I mentioned, the ISEF voucher cannot be used to cover installation costs, including engineering design costs, labor, or utility upgrade costs, like the cost of transformers, trenching, or conduit. But if you do use a portion of the ISEF voucher to support the purchase of electric vehicle charging equipment, the provider is responsible to ensure that the installation of such equipment meets AB 841 requirements, or Assembly Bill 841. So essentially, Assembly Bill 841 requires that contractors installing electric vehicle charging infrastructure have the appropriate license and classification as identified by the contractor's state license board, and have at least one electrician on each crew at any given time who holds an electric vehicle training program certification. For projects that include installation of charging ports supplying 25 kilowatts or more to a vehicle, those must have at least 25% of the total electricians working on the crew must have EVITP certification. So for those projects in which ISEF funds infrastructure, there will be some additional documentation that's required to demonstrate the requirements of AB 841 have been met. And we actually just released an updated version of the ISEF implementation manual yesterday that provides a little bit more detail on the electric vehicle infrastructure training program certification requirements, and what additional documentation would be required for providers who choose to use a portion of the ISEF voucher to cover infrastructure. So I'll add a link to that new version of the implementation manual in the chat.
Great, thank you. That concludes our presentation for today. So I will stop sharing my screen, and we do still have some time available if there are additional questions. I see now also that attendees are able to raise their hand. So if you prefer to raise your hand and ask your question, I can unmute you. Should a provider wait for the cap to be removed or put in applications over the cap in case funds aren't used and to get in the queue? This is from Robert Kelly. The recommendation that I often make to those who are seeking first come, first serve vouchers is that when your customer is ready and you have a purchase order, is probably the right time to put in a voucher request and then to wait and see if additional funds become available. So I believe the answer to your question is yes, unless Andrea has something else to add.
No, I think that covers it.
I'm looking at the HVIP site, but cannot provide the provider application. Is it currently posted? I will check quickly to try to find that link for you and put it in the chat here. We'll also send it around to all of the attendees. Will the provider applications be available today? Yes. It looks like it's going to be posted immediately after the webinar. Please confirm if vouchers can be used for repower of commercial vehicles. Well, the same rules apply as standard HVIP, but I'll turn it over to Andrea to explain how conversions work in HVIP.
Yes, so you can use an ISEF voucher for repowered commercial vehicles, so long as those vehicles have eligibility within the standard HVIP program. The same rules apply for calculating voucher amounts within standard ISEF as in standard HVIP. So that means for repowered or conversion vehicles, there is actually a 50% deduction to the overall voucher cost. So I'd encourage you to take a look in the HVIP implementation or the ISEF implementation manual. We do actually lay out an example calculation of what it would look like for a repowered hydrogen vehicle or hydrogen fuel cell vehicle and what the overall cost would be. So that's a great place to go and get some additional information on how the voucher amount works for repowered vehicles.
We have a question here. Does a provider need to identify a dealer at the time of the provider application? That's a great question, actually. So we don't, I don't believe require that a dealer is listed. However, you do need to identify the vehicle, right, in order to identify the pricing. So most likely, in order to be able to accurately identify both the vehicle and pricing, you may already have a relationship with the dealer, though I do not believe that it is required. I don't see any raised hands at this time. And I don't see any more questions coming in. All right. So with that, we may be able to conclude a bit early today. However, if you continue to have questions, the best email, which I believe all of you have, is isef@californiahvip.org. That email reaches everyone on our team, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have. Again, the steps to participate in the provider application are available also on the website, californiahvip.org. / go to the purchasers page. At the very top right of the page, you can see a link to purchasers. That's really where you find information about the various set-asides, including the school bus set-aside, and this ISEF set-aside will be listed in that area as well, where you can find more information, as well as Andrea mentioned, the implementation manual that was recently re-released with some additional updates. So feel free to reach out to any member of this team. Take a look at the documentation that's already available. And we very much look forward to receiving your provider applications over the next couple of weeks, and we'll be asking questions as we continue to evaluate those. And then you will find the list of eligible providers listed in the middle of August, and we will open for voucher requests at the end of August. Anything else additionally you'd like to say, Andrea?
I think that covers it pretty well. Thank you all for participating today. We really appreciate your time and look forward to seeing provider eligibility applications come in.
Yes, and thanks so much for helping us over the year that it's taken to develop this. We've really appreciated all of your input. And as we continue to develop and refine the program, we look forward to your recommendations and suggestions. Thanks.